Hey y'all, welcome to Pleiadian Point of View. I'm Peyton, and I'm a Pleiadian channel and starseed coach. So in today's video, the Pleiadians wanted to talk to us a little bit about one of the big mistakes they see us making in the spiritual community. This is one of those things that we think we're doing it right, and we're actually doing the opposite of what we intend to do. So one of the big things that we're very conscious of in the spiritual community these days is staying on our timeline, right? We have heard all of our spiritual teachers talking about this. The Pleiadians talk about this all the time, about the importance of staying focused on what we want to create. But in the process of doing this, we tend to slide into making a common mistake. So in today's video, the P's are going to talk a little bit about what this mistake is that they see us making and how we can avoid it. But before we jump into talking about this very important topic, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and the like button if you haven't done that yet. So when we are looking at the topic of matching our timeline or being on our highest timeline, this is actually a fairly complex subject. So this video is going to be a minute or two longer than what you're used to because this is a really important topic and I want to make sure that I do it justice. So in order to figure out how we stay on our highest timeline, we have to go back to the beginning. Now, when we are creating things as humans, we know that everything is about energy. So how do we handle those negative things that are happening in the world so that we are not matching the timeline of some of the scary stories that we see floating in the world around us? Well, this is where we can get a little off track in the spiritual community because most of us are very aware by now that we create everything. Everything is our energy, but when we see those upsetting things happening in the world, our ego mind has a life of its own. And our ego mind is very conditioned as humans when we see something we don't want to scream no at it. We think that if we shout no, if we are pushing against, if we are fighting that thing, getting mad at it, that we are rejecting it. But as the P's always like to do, they bring us back to the energetics of the situation. So when we are shouting no at something, pushing against it, getting mad at it, getting scared of it, what happens is we are energetically increasing it. We are voting for it. That is how the energy of these situations works. So one of the things that we want to be aware of as we start to see these negative things happening in the world is how we are responding to them. Because if we are putting very strong negative emotion on that topic, and the way you will figure this out is just see how you are reacting when you see that news story or you see that post pop up on social media. What does your physical body do in response? If you are tightening up your muscles, if you are getting that sour feeling in your gut, that clenching in the heart chakra, or if you're getting into those negative emotions, those very strong emotions of fear, anger, powerlessness, what is happening energetically is you are matching the energy of that situation, which means you're feeding it. And that's not what we want to be doing as creators. So when the P's are talking to us about the importance of staying on our highest timeline, staying aligned with what we want to create, it's really important for us to stop for a second when we feel ourselves reacting and look to see if we're falling into this trap of pushing against. Because when we find ourselves sliding into negative emotion, especially those very strong negative emotions like fear, anger, guilt, powerlessness, we are putting a lot of energy on a particular topic or a particular story. This is what we call in energy work, matching something's energy. This is something we do naturally. It's just kind of part of the human experience, is that we tend to automatically match the energy of what's happening around us. Whether that is information we're taking in or whether that is another person, we tend to match the energy of what we're seeing because as humans, we are just conditioned to react. It's just what we do. But very important as light workers and starseeds to be thinking about the energy of this situation and what that actually means for our life experience. Because when we start to get very invested in some of the scary stories in the world, what happens is we are putting a lot of our energy on attaching to the timeline of that event. because you are matching its energy. That is the same as voting for it, because you always have the free will to control your vibration. It is one of the only things we can control, right? And so we want to be really aware as lightworkers and starseeds what we are voting for with our energy. So what do we do to avoid sliding into this pitfall? Well, the way the P's like to explain it is they encourage us to aim for a neutral no, which means you can look at some of the stories that are popping up in the world around you and simply ask yourself if this is what you want to create in your future reality. Or another way to look at it is, do you want to bring that into your future? And if the answer is no, the P's encourage us to strive for a neutral no, which means to be able to look at that thing that's happening in the world and look at it from the perspective of a witness, as if you are stepping outside of that emotional firestorm of the ego mind and just asking yourself the simple question, do I want to include this in my future? Because the P's always like to bring us back to the basics of how we create our reality. And one of the key parts of that is that there's not a single version of reality, which means that news story we're seeing is not the only choice. Right next to that, available in the next second for you, is a completely different reality. So that means we don't have to take what is happening in the world as the only way, the only version of reality, because it's actually not. It is one of infinite versions of reality. Now, this is where we hit a really important point. The P's are never telling us to be in avoidance, denial, or suppression. And so the way you can figure out if you're falling into that trap of avoidance is if you are refusing to look at something because you know it's going to upset you. If you are, then what is happening is you may be sliding into that territory of avoidance, denial, or suppression. Because if we are going through life with our blinders on, not looking at things, we're still matching the energy of it, which means even though we're not putting our attention on it directly, that story still triggers strong negative emotion inside of us. And so what that means is, even though you're not looking at that news story, you're still matching its energy, which means you are still energetically voting for it. So we don't want to be in that territory. So what the P's encourage us to do when we are kind of looking at some of these negative things in the world, and we know we don't want to bring them into our reality, is to look at it more neutrally. Because when you take that step back into what we sometimes refer to as witness mode or observer mode, what happens is you can make the decision whether you want to match its energy. Because when you take that step back into being an observer or a witness of what is going on, you can be a little more neutral in your reaction to it. And what happens then is you just make an objective decision. Do you want to include this in your future? And you're not pushing against it. You're not invalidating it or putting judgment on it. Because when we are fighting something, screaming no at it, thinking we are rejecting something, we're putting a lot of energy into feeding that timeline. But if we can look at something, just realize that it is not really what we want to create in our future, say no thank you, and remove our attention from it, we are keeping ourselves from matching its timeline. It is when we don't realize we're having that strong negative emotional reaction to something that we actually put ourselves on a timeline we don't want. So it all comes down to the neutrality of your reaction. And the way you figure this out is you have to be brutally self-honest. You are the only one who knows how you are responding to something. And y'all, this can be like balancing on a razor blade, where it is so easy for us to go from being neutral to sliding into avoidance or rejection. So this is something that we have to keep an eye on ourselves with, because we are just so programmed as humans to respond immediately. We have that knee-jerk reaction. And so what we're doing is we're retraining the body-mind system to just chill out a bit, to step back, be a little more neutral, as if you're a scientist observing an experiment, just deciding, did this work or did this not work? Because when you can achieve that level of what the P's refer to as a neutral no, You can move away from things that you don't want to create in your life without getting into that slippery slope of avoidance or denial. And then the next step of this process is always to redirect your attention into what you want to create instead. Because as we start to pull back and collapse some of these very dense 3D timelines, we have to give our mind something else to create in its place. The universe hates a vacuum. So when you start to decide that some of these big collective storylines of suffering, struggle, illness, disease, suppression are not really what you want to create in your future, it's important for us to take that next step of feeding with our imagination what we do want to create. Because if not, you're not giving your mind anything to create in place of what you're walking away from. So the re-architecting of the energy is very important, but we want to make sure that we're not sliding into that territory of denial or suppression where we are refusing to look at something. And another way that we can slide into this, and y'all, this was a big trap for me back in the early days of my awakening, is talking positive over it, right? We see that news story that freaks us out and we start to immediately jump into affirmations of what we want, right? And that trying to talk yourself over something or talk over the top of your emotional reaction, again, just matches energies with it. So that's another way that can be a little tricky that we can fall into as light workers and starseeds, where we think we're doing the right thing because we are saying to ourselves over and over in our mind what we want to create, but our energy is still matching what we don't want. So again, aiming for that neutrality is what we're after, to be able to look at something unwanted without pushing against it. And this is something we have to train ourselves on because we are so conditioned as humans to push against things, to think that if we are fighting something with anger and fear and shouting and getting all worked up about it, we're rejecting something. Nope, you're voting for it. So the P's just wanted to talk us through this a little bit because they see it as one of the big mistakes that we are making as a spiritual community without realizing it. And that is because we're pushing against so many things in our world right now. Because there's a lot out there that we don't want to include in our future. But in order to do that, to create new, we have to remove our energy from the old. And if you're pushing against it, if you're mad at it, if you are scared of it, you are voting for it. So it's really important to understand the energetics of these situations so that we can position ourselves on our highest timeline and not glue ourselves to what we don't want. So I hope this helps you figure out a little bit how to stay on your highest timeline, because this is going to be more important in the coming weeks and months, y'all, as we see more chaos in the denser timelines. And we don't want to be accidentally matching ourselves to that. But we also don't want to be avoiding and suppressing it, because that gets us to the same result. We still are matching the energy. So this is one of the ways that the P's are suggesting that we approach some of these things that we'd rather not see in our future. So I hope this helps you. Don't forget, hit the subscribe button and the like button if you haven't done that yet. I'll see you next time. Bye, y'all.